Hi everyone, and welcome to our 2021 kickoff for our Australia-India Institute Bilateral Bites podcasts. 2020 was clearly a shock to the global economy, and we thought we would start this year with a Republic Day special talking about India's economy and India's foreign policy. In this session, we are delighted to invite Ila Patnaik, a renowned Indian economist, former Principal Economic Advisor to the Government of India, who also prepared the Annual Economic Survey of India, a professor with the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. Ila is also a frequent contributor to The Print and a sought-after commentator on India's economic recovery post-COVID. Ila was also on the advisory committee for the Varghese report, India Economic Strategy, and so has also been involved in Australia-India bilateral economic activity as well. Professor Patnaik, welcome very much.
Thank you, Tanya. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So as we've also heard you comment and seen in The Print, India, like every country in the world, was also heavily impacted by COVID in 2020. Yet we see that India may in fact be the fastest growing economy for 2021. Would you like to comment on that and where we could expect to see growth?
Yeah, I think we've been fortunate, and in many ways, we've done better than what we thought we would do when the pandemic had hit us. And that's really what has helped the economy more than anything else. That when the pandemic hit and we went for a very early lockdown, if you remember at that time, I think it was quite a surprise. And there were many things that went right and many things that went wrong with it, but it was a huge risk to do that sort of an early lockdown. But when we went for that, we thought our health system is so much worse than the health system of countries like Italy or the US, where we are seeing a large number of deaths. And we went in for a complete national lockdown when there were barely 100 cases maybe in the country. So at that time, it was a choice between lives and livelihoods. And the choice that was made was in favor of lives. That raised the expectation that since we had put livelihoods after lives, then we are going to have a much bigger shock to the economy than perhaps those countries that were trying to keep the economy going, even though that meant COVID might spread much more. I think what's happened in this 1 year is that actually the health outcome was, of course, not good. I mean, we've lost more than 100,000 lives, but it was not as bad as we expected. We were able to cope. It isn't that the health system completely, fell apart, or that there were queues, or as people had predicted, dead bodies on the street, and the scenarios that were being created were horrible. So that didn't happen. So somehow we as a country, as a government, as a people were cautious, took the precautions, and now we see both COVID cases and COVID deaths come down. That has led to two things. One, people being optimistic and therefore coming out, working, getting back to business, which is keeping the economy up. And second, that now that time has passed and now that there's also a vaccine on the table, so with that time in hand, we are able to look forward and get back on our feet. So both the precautions that people took during that time, because things were not as bad and we had taken early steps, and the development of the vaccine are now getting the economy back on track. People are coming back. There are, of course, certain sectors where things will continue to be a little slower than others. But yes, we are seeing good signs of the economy coming back on track.
Yeah, thank you. Those are really interesting observations, most poignantly starting with confidence. So where people have confidence to turn up to work, feel that it's a safer environment to return to. Some of those concerns become known factors that people can then operate within a known framework. And the promise of a vaccine can all inspire confidence to participate in the economy, and therefore perhaps starting to attract investment as well. India seems to have positioned itself quite well during 2020, in addition to those early acting for lives over livelihoods, as you said, while COVID expectedly spread quite a lot in a country where the population is one of the highest in the world. At the same time, you allowed, I guess, a stagger so that less people overflowed the hospitals at one time. During that time, the government certainly seemed to be very active in promoting a number of reforms. The new education policy was published during that time. There seems to be a number of activities on health as well. But interestingly, and I think most recently, are the agricultural reforms. How will the agricultural reform sector, the reforms there change the structure of the economy in terms of labour and perhaps impact for production and export in agriculture?
These are very, very radical reforms. Just to give a background to those who might not perhaps have followed the full reform process in India for the last 30 years, let me just take you back to 1991. What we did in 1991 was to free up the industrial sector, which is that you don't need a license to produce, you don't need a license to import, which earlier used to be the case till 91. So we freed up manufacturing, we freed up services. But the one sector that we did not free up, where you needed licenses to buy or sell, so that's the whole reform about, is that was left untouched. So the agricultural sector, which was still a very large share of the economy, and more than a large share of the economy, employed a very large share of the population, continued to be so restricted that you and I, if we were sitting, in India, I could not have produced something on a farm and sold it to you. I had to sell it compulsorily by the law only to a licensed trader who was licensed to buy it in an APMC. Now, that, along with some of the other reforms the laws that have been proposed, are fundamentally to free up the farmer from the kind of shackles that the industrial sector used to have. So these were restrictions imposed on the agricultural sector. You can't do contract farming, so somebody can't buy directly from you. If he does, he has to take a license from every APMC, or at least even if there were 3-4 APMCs put together, then he had to go and take a license from the state government. So it is what we used to call the license permit Raj in the pre-1991 liberalization days, which was there for manufacturing. Now, under the Constitution of India, all of us are equal. The farmer should have an equal right. Now, you contrast what I'm saying with what's happening in protests in Delhi. And the obvious question should be, so then why are they protesting? Why are farmers protesting against this? So fundamentally, there's a section of farmers who, it seems that they believe that, no, I don't know to what extent this is political, but they believe that this is being done to somehow get rid of the MSP and the procurement that is done by the government. So the government procures mainly wheat and rice. And we have go downs full of wheat and rice. In fact, we have wheat and rice on airstrips, we have it on roads, we have just everywhere excess stocks of wheat and rice. So it seems that as if it is to actually address that problem. But there is no connection between the two. You can continue to have an MSP, you can continue to have public procurement while you allow farmers to diversify and to sell to other people. So that's
Can you just
really,
quickly explain MSP for those of us who don't know?
yeah. So MSP is a minimum support price, where the government says, I will purchase wheat, rice, and any other crop for which it gives an MSP at a certain rate, at
Mhm.
a certain price. So, you know, that is the conflict that has come up, but I don't really feel that that is a real conflict. I think it's more the traders who are benefiting, because they had monopolist powers. They had licenses which allowed only them to buy from the farmers. So in fact, this increases competition in the market, because you're allowing more people to buy, and eventually this will give you more diversification. This will allow those who wish to export products to buy more easily. You'll be able to buy and sell maybe to other countries, other parts of the country, which today you can't, because you're bound to the local APMC, the Agricultural Price Marketing Committee, which has the license to buy from farmers in that region.
No, that makes good sense. And certainly the reports in the media have been a bit conflicting with, seeing farmers protesting in Delhi and being very concerned. But certainly from an Australian perspective, the reforms have been welcomed as potentially providing diversity also within the Australian market. So if this would free up India to export more of its agricultural produce, Australia has been saying for a decade now that there is some natural complementarity within India's capability in agriculture and Australia's capability. We already market and export pulses to India, but equally, mangoes coming in. We spoke recently about ginger. There's a shortage of ginger in Australia at the moment, and when available, it's about $45 a kilo. So if imports from India at about $2 to $3 a kilo could touch our shores, again, that's something that I think would be a welcome complementarity also for consumers. So we discussed farmers and traders, but consumers seem to be beneficiaries in terms of diversity available of choice as well. So no, that's shed a lot of light in the agricultural sector. More generally, Prime Minister Modi was speaking of Atmanirbhar Bharat, which would apply to many sectors, this idea of self-reliance. Now, this was something that has come up during the COVID economy year, but also impacted by geopolitics and other things, particularly relations with China, but also disruptions to the global supply chain that happened as a result of COVID, and thinking about national security and therefore increased self-reliance. Australia has had its own discussions about the diversification of global supply chains to regional supply chains to ensure strength of certain markets and access to certain goods. Do you have views on Atmanirbhar Bharat as supporting the Indian economy and where we could see greater manufacturing or more manufacturing hubs in which sectors?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think I would like to clarify about Atmanirbhar Bharat
Sure.
is that there is one view that this means we want to shut down the economy, and that's
Mm.
not the case. I mean, you find this idea in the BJP way back, for the last 50 years or so, where the idea is that we don't want to be dependent on anybody. We want to be global leaders. We want to go out in the world. So, the NDA one regime, which was 1991 to 1999 to 2004, when the BJP was earlier in power, that regime had promoted things like outward foreign direct investment by Indian companies. So go out into the world, become global leaders, not be dependent on anyone else. I think part of the new version of that, the Atmanirbhar Bharat package that we are seeing, is also about how do we cope with the rise of China. If you look across the world, I think many countries are grappling with how to deal with the fact that earlier we believed that if we did import liberalization, it would get greater competition into the economy. Whereas today, when we do greater import liberalization, and this is not just India, I mean, look at Europe as well. Whenever somebody liberalizes imports, then instead of greater competition in the economy, they often see their local industry die out, and Chinese either products come in, or sometimes, as we see in the case of Italy, Chinese companies move in and then manufacture there with Chinese workers. And this is something that many countries are trying to cope with. How do you keep your local industry going while marrying it with the idea of trade liberalization? And the earlier beliefs that, oh, we just had to open up and that will bring more competition in, those have been shaken very badly after the rise of China. So this package tries to promote Indian manufacturing. So we have this productivity linked scheme where in PLI, productivity linked incentives under this scheme, for example, where companies are encouraged to produce here. And this is happening now in a number of sectors. And slowly, even so for example, electronics or mobile phones, slowly it is moving from assembly to increasingly producing many parts here. And that is the direction in which the government hopes to take the economy towards, so that we don't become dependent on all manufacturing on imports. And particularly, I think today the sense is that because China is able to do large scale manufacturing, and there are increasing returns to scale in that large scale manufacturing. So how do you protect your own industry? How do you encourage your own industry? And I think that's what lies behind this entire package and thinking, that we don't want to be dependent, but it's not that we want to be closed. We, in fact, would like to be global leaders, be part of global supply chains, be, Indian companies operating abroad in many sectors.
Certainly. No, I think it was worthwhile making that clarification because it has been misunderstood in various guises. But that's certainly my interpretation as well, that it's not about closing India's economy. And there had been some concern about going back to a pre-1991 economic model. Rather, I think it's about moving up the supply chain. So instead of being a net importer of finished products and only perhaps providing componentry, or being the assembly but not having the inputs, which was also an expensive way to do things. Atmanirbhar Bharat is about moving up the supply chain to being an overall exporter and therefore a global leader in certain sectors. You mentioned already looking at that in terms of mobile phones. I think we've seen the same idea starting to take place in defence and increasingly in pharmaceuticals, which I thought we could briefly touch on, because I know you've done a little bit of work in health economics as well. But within pharmaceuticals, India is already well known as the pharmacist of the world, so-called, particularly in generic pharma. But increasingly part of Atmanirbhar Bharat, as you said, was a response to reliance on China as far as the APIs go, because a lot of those inputs into pharmaceuticals had come from China. And there's now an understanding that these can actually be developed in India for Indian production. So that's for pharmaceuticals. Separately, because of the scale plus the technology available in India, with pharmaceutical hubs in the south, in Bangalore, Hyderabad, but also Mumbai, and emerging in the northeast as well, there's an idea that that scale can also be a really impactful response to the vaccine development currently. Do you have views on the health sector and whether that will form an increasing part of India's economy or exports, be a strong export sector?
India has, as you said, many advantages already, and is
Mm.
in some cases like like vaccines, even a global leader. So India has those advantages. I think something that we just starting another. So while yes, I agree that there are advantages in modern medicine, and in we also have a lot of healthcare, health tourism. So neighborhood countries from the neighborhood, people who find that our services are good and yet affordable, often come for treatment to many hospitals here, and hospitals are getting registered with global coming to global standards, and finding that they are able to get a lot of this is just in terms of, it's an export of service. So when you
Yeah.
have patients come in, for the domestic health sector also, there has been, I think, a greater awareness that it needs reforms. Now we have huge challenges here, because though we've brought in insurance, we have the challenge of regulation. So today, neither is the insurance sector very well regulated, nor is the health sector very well regulated. So the challenge there is, how do we have a very large insurance program when neither of the two are very well regulated? So I think on that, we are, government is going to have to think very seriously about how to make sure that, these, because health is one sector where there's so much asymmetric information, that this is a sector that needs better regulation. I think in addition, I must mention that there is another part of medicine, that medicine and health and wellness, in which India has an advantage, and that is traditional wellness. So whether it is yoga or it is Ayurvedic medicines, again, they all need regulation. So some initiative has already started on how you can bring those to be more scientific, in terms of having the same methods, like trials and regulation in terms of what the medicines can be regulated, like the FDA does. But that's another sector where India has a huge advantage. And I think if countries like yours do take an interest in that sector, because ultimately medicine is not just about cure, but also about healthy lifestyles that are preventive in nature, then there can be further collaboration in that field.
No, I think that's a really good point. Your last one in particular. You would be aware of the Anil Wadhwa report that Minister Goyal launched in December, a response to the Varghese report that you were involved with. Talks about the major sectors that India sees as relevant with Australia. Health is one of them, and wellness was actually one of the ones that uh, Ambassador Wadhwa highlighted in his report as part of that CII response. Certainly, we saw traditional Chinese medicine enter more mainstream health responses in Australia, including acupuncture being provided for by insurance. Part of responding to the regulation of traditional Chinese medicine in Australia was also an FTA outcome between Australia and China. So perhaps that is certainly something we could see on the horizon going forward. And another outcome of COVID, obviously, with many people under lockdown in Australia and India, is the impact of yoga on mental health, understanding wellness responses from a wellbeing perspective, and a non-pharmaceutical intervention to increase resilience for all of us at home as well. So I think that's a really, really good point. Just to bring everything together at the end, we've covered a range of sectors from pharmaceuticals, agriculture, we touched on electronics as well. In your view, gazing at India's economy 2021 and noting the impacts of COVID still permeating some of our manufacturing and services provision capability, where are the bright spots in your view?
Um, In terms of in the Indian economy, uh,
Yes.
so I think what is needs to pick up now, rather than thinking just sectorally, is that as confidence comes back, uh, investment has to go up. And the bright spot, in my view, would be if this year we see a turnaround in investment, whether it is in manufacturing, whether it is in services, in education, in many, many fields where, unfortunately, because we were in a phase of we had some banking difficulties and financial sector issues, as well as policy issues. So we were in a phase where that was not as healthy as one would have liked to see. Primarily private corporate investment. But hopefully, what COVID and this whole crisis is doing is it is making policymakers aware that that for the economy to we do need the economy to turn around, and for the economy to turn around, it is critical that private investment sees an upturn. So, in my view, if what we see in the coming year is a better environment for private investment. So we've already seen, for example, an announcement last week that said that there will be a single window for large FDI coming in. So like that, even for the tax regime, the capital controls regime, the regulations that form the framework for companies to function, if all of those are made more investor friendly, then I think that would be the thing to watch out for. That not only is the Indian economy going to be the fastest growing because we're going to come back to the pre-COVID levels, but if this helps us to rethink, and I think it is that's happening, and that's why we've got Atmanirbhar Bharat and productivity linked incentives and so on. So if we move towards a more investor friendly regime, particularly domestic investors, I'm not just talking of foreign investors, but because that's the biggest driver in the economy, then that would be the brightest spot for India.
No, I think very well said. Investment was also one of the things highlighted in the India economic strategy, both in two ways, in the Varghese report, as you would know, and in the Anil Wadhwa report recently launched in December, that more inward investment from Australia into India would be welcome. Your point about bringing in domestic investors as well, I guess another impact of seeing a heavily impacted global economy and a fast growing India is that India may look also very attractive to domestic investors as well, relatively speaking. We've certainly covered quite a lot of ground. It's been such a pleasure to be with you, and thank you very much for shedding a little bit more insight into what we could expect to see potentially for the Indian economy in 2021.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, Tanya. Thanks for having me.